The question is that the amendments be agreed to, and I call the honourable member for Deakin.
Well, thanks very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. It is a pleasure to have the opportunity to speak on this debate with respect to the plebiscite same-sex marriage bill. Very pleasingly, this introduction of this bill is the culmination of our fulfilment of a clear mandate that we took to the last election. It was very, very clear to Australians when they went to a polling booth on the 2nd of July that should the Turnbull government be re-elected, that our view was that a vote in Parliament on same-sex marriage would only occur following a public vote, a plebiscite, put to the Australian people to garner their views on the proposed change to this very, very important institution. So the fact that the Labor Party and the Greens have chosen to oppose this legislation is very disappointing. Not surprising, but disappointing. What is surprising, though, about it, because I accept that particularly the Shorten opposition is basically obsessed with any political advantage they can get, and I don't whinge about that. I can understand that oppositions engage is a general rule in political advantage as opposed to fulfilling what I think should be the values that this parliament should uphold. But putting that aside, what did surprise me is the Labor Party's seemingly their position that the Australian people cannot be trusted and indeed are not entitled to have a view on a proposed change to this very, very important institution. That is what surprised me and surprised many of my colleagues, and I suspect secretly surprised some people within the Labor Party itself. Now, we know the Labor Party has basically adopted an approach that anybody who supports a traditional view of marriage effectively has their pre-selection in jeopardy, and we know from 2019 they will bind all their party members to a position adopting a same-sex marriage. But it is very, very surprising to me that they would use that argument, particularly in the context of a parliament where we will soon be, presumably, trying to further the recognition of Indigenous Australians in our constitution. Now, I wonder if those opposite will use an argument that we shouldn't proceed with a referendum recognising Indigenous Australians in our constitution for fear that such a referendum would unleash hate in our society. It would bring out the fringe groups, the racist fringe groups in our society, thereby causing Indigenous Australians much hurt. Now, I don't think, might I say, that is a flimsy argument, but it is an argument that I would expect correlates with the argument that they've put forward here, that because of the fear that a debate in a plebiscite could contain elements that make unsavoury, unfair, cruel or harsh comments, that we shouldn't have a plebiscite. Well, clearly that same theory would apply to the recognition of Indigenous Australians in the Constitution. But might I say that we've been having this debate for many, many years. And it was the advocates of same-sex marriage who have insisted on ensuring that this is debated in our society, notwithstanding the fact that we've had 16 individual pieces of legislation either introduced, debated and voted for in this parliament. So on the basis of that argument that why would we want to unleash such hatred and hateful comments into our society, why has that been a perpetual, in a sense, a perpetual campaign from the advocates of same-sex marriage? Clearly, those issues weren't a concern at that time. So I am very proud that as a government we are fulfilling our election mandate, but more importantly, crucially, saying to the Australian people, we think you deserve to have a direct say on a change in an important institution like marriage. You deserve that. Now, I know the Labor Party, because most of them end up crawling their way onto these benches through the union movement, through patronage and other things. I know that those opposite, who scarcely would live or socialise or spend much time outside a 5-kilometre radius of our CBDs. I know they don't really have a great ability to converse with what I would describe as mainstream Australians. They are displaying the same arrogance that, that we just saw very recently with the Brexit campaign in the UK. The same arrogance that says, you do not deserve, you are not entitled, and you cannot be trusted to have a say on an important issue such as this. Leave it to us. We know best. And what we do know is that amongst most Australians, that they are decent, they have views, they can agree to disagree, they will differ, but they can have a respectful debate. And when we talk about being concerned about the consequences of a plebiscite, concerned about the campaign, well, I'd make 2 points. Firstly, I don't think the plebiscite campaign would be markedly different to the campaign we've seen for the last 5 years. I mean, these issues have been aired. They have been aired in detail. It feels like we've spoken about this issue ad nauseum for at least 5 years. So I don't think a plebiscite, albeit the intensity of a campaign, particularly given that our plebiscite is scheduled to be held on the 11th of February, a relatively short period, there would be some intensity, but I don't think the substance of the arguments that would be aired in that debate would be markedly different from what we've seen over the last 5 or so years. The second point I'd make is when we're talking about the concern of fringe groups and hurtful, hateful, negative comments is, yes, I am somebody, to be honest, who is concerned with that issue. I'm very concerned for those people who hold a traditional view of marriage, because they are the ones who are subject to the most hateful, vitriolic comments that I've seen. I would ask any member in this House to express on Twitter or Facebook their view of a traditional view of marriage and see what sort of comments they get. I challenge them to do that. So yes, I do share those concerns. Most importantly, or most relevantly, I share those concerns for those who have a traditional view of marriage, but of course that would equally apply to same-sex marriage advocates. But for the Labor Party to argue that it is just same-sex marriage advocates who would potentially be subject to that vitriol is incorrect. And I would say those who are on the traditional view of marriage case have been suffering that for many, many years. So I'm one of those people who doesn't support a change in the Marriage Act. So that's my, in a sense, why I believe that a plebiscite is something that is fair and a responsible course of action from this government. It's very disappointing because a plebiscite, and plebiscites as a concept, are not novel. Yes, they don't happen all the time, but they are not, in Australian political history, novel. They have been employed to deal with a number of difficult issues over the years. So for the Labor Party to say that it's unprecedented for the Australian Parliament, in a sense, to seek the Australian people's views on highly contentious and highly significant issues is wrong. From conscription and many others, the Australian Parliament has asked the Australian people for their view on these sort of serious questions. So if the Australian Parliament could do that on conscription, no one's seriously arguing, or no one, I don't think, seriously argued that the Australian people shouldn't have had a say on conscription, albeit in our history. This is an institution. This is an institution that marriage as an institution is one that formally and informally has developed over millennia. It's been adopted into our civil law, and in my view it's an institution that belongs to the people. It's not an institution of government. It's an institution that belongs to the people, and they should be the arbiters. They should be the direct and final arbiters of whether we make a significant change to the definition of marriage. Not a minor tweak. This is a significant and a fundamental change to the definition of marriage. So I'm very, very pleased that on the 11th of February, should this House and the Senate pass this bill, that we will have a public vote on this question. I'm also very pleased to note that in this legislation, funding will be provided to both campaigns, constituted in a similar fashion to the way funding was provided in the Republican referendum in the late 90s. That both campaigns will have access to that funding, because I think it's important that in putting forward this question to the Australian people, that they are entitled to hear the respective arguments of both of those cases. And we've seen to date it's been basically one-way traffic as far as that case being made. And I don't begrudge the same-sex marriage advocates. I think all power to them. They've run a very strong campaign. They've been very strong advocates for their case. They're obviously very, very well organised and extraordinarily well funded. I don't begrudge them that. I think it's fantastic, and in a democracy that's wonderful. And when they commenced that campaign, I didn't hear those in the Labor Party saying, well, just be careful, guys, because I don't want you to unleash any hatred in our society by starting this campaign. So it's surprising they've adopted that now. But it's important with this funding and that we'll have both cases aired in a way that will ensure that Australian people, when they go to the ballot box on the 11th of February, are able to make an informed decision. Importantly, this legislation also provides that we will replicate, to the greatest extent possible, the ordinary voting experience for people at a polling booth on the 11th of February. We didn't want this to be novel. We wanted it to, in a sense, replicate the voting experience that most people would have, as they did when they went to the polling booths on the 2nd of July, and, in a sense, gave us a mandate for this legislation, of course. So the ordinary rules around pre-poll, voting in person, attendance voting, postal voting will apply. So it's easily understood. I think it was important for the purposes of this plebiscite that there wasn't anything novel or anything that the government, or indeed the parliament, could be accused as, in a sense, changing for the benefit of one side or other of the argument. And I think we've successfully done that. I don't think anybody has criticised that the legislation, the bill before us, provides a voting experience that would be easily understood and familiar to all Australians. So can I just conclude by saying it is a proud moment for the government. It's a proud moment for me as a member of this government that, in the face of vitriolic hostility, the base accusations of the Labor Party impugning our motives behind this legislation, and the inherent disregard or the inherent belittling of the Australian people that is basically contained within their argument that the Australian people cannot be trusted and don't have the right to make this decision, that we, in the face of all of that, have brought this legislation before the House, fulfilling a key commitment that we took to the election, and most importantly, and this is the most important thing, ensuring that if there is to be a change to same-sex marriage, that all Australians could say, well, this was a decision by the people. And alternatively, if there's no change, that the advocates of same-sex marriage will say, again, whilst they wouldn't be happy with the outcome, would appreciate that in a democracy the decision of the people was not to change the Marriage Act. And I think both sides of the argument, whoever they, in a sense, the losing side was, I think they would be, in a sense, happier knowing that, that their ambitions were frustrated not by a political stitch-up in this parliament, not by lobby groups and highly and well-funded advocacy groups running long-term campaigns, but actually that in a democracy the majority rules. And that is the greatest thing about this plebiscite, is that ultimately, whichever side is frustrated in their attempts, whether that's the advocates for same-sex marriage or those advocates of traditional marriage, that they will live with the outcome because it will be the determination of the Australian people. So I commend this bill.